The Cuban Revolution is recorded in human history as the ideal model for overthrowing a tyrannical regime and establishing the rule of the people in the purest form of revolutionary governance. The Cuban Revolution is depicted in a rosy light in communist literature as it transformed Cuba from a colony of foreign interests and privileges into a free state in control of its own destiny. Today's episode is about the Cuban Revolution, but we'll be looking at its realistic picture. Together, we'll explore the details of this significant event and get to know its icons, who happen to be the most charismatic political figures of the 20th century, to the extent that their images are the most widespread on t-shirts and graffiti worldwide. Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and Camilo Cienfuegos are among these figures. The story begins on March 10, 1952. The day democratic rule in Cuba ended after a military coup staged by President Fulgencio Batista before the election scheduled for June of the same year, as he was expected to lose. Batista seized power by force and established a military dictatorship on the island, supported by the United States, which had significant economic interests in Cuba, notably in the sugar and liquor industries and in tourism. For the Americans, Batista did what was required by providing stability and security. However, American support for his brutal regime meant the United States harvested the Cuban people's hatred, considering it a colonial power. As with any tyrannical rule, opposition arose, and at the forefront of this opposition was a young lawyer born into a wealthy Cuban family named Fidel Alejandro Castro. Fidel Castro was politically active all his life, even before Batista's coup, and had nominated himself in the aborted 1952 elections. However, after the coup, he became more convinced that the military dictatorship in Cuba could only be removed through an armed revolution, which he began planning for. Castro started recruiting people who could join him in a guerrilla war against Batista's regime. The pamphlets he distributed resonated widely, and he managed to gather around 1,500 activists around him, both from the opposition within Batista's party and from student leaders in Cuban universities. Castro also convinced his followers to seek the necessary guns and weapons for the revolution. Castro's plan was to attack the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, the island's second-largest city located in the southeast. The barracks were the most important military base outside the capital and were close to the courthouse. By taking control of the base, the courthouse, the radio station, and the nearby hospital, the armed movement could broadcast its statement and call for the return of democracy to Cuba. Castro expected this movement to be sufficient to motivate the Cuban people to act against Batista's regime. After months of training on revolutionary plans, on the dawn of July 26, 1953, a group of 119 individuals attacked the Moncada barracks, but the attack failed miserably. The rebels couldn't even pass the barracks gate. 8 of them were killed, more than 70 were captured, and many were immediately executed on the spot in Moncada. But a small number of rebels, including Fidel Castro, were forced to flee. Batista declared martial law throughout Cuba. Within days, Castro received guarantees from the government that he would not be killed or tortured, and based on these guarantees, he surrendered. During his trial, and as a lawyer, he defended himself. But Castro didn't use his defense to plead for himself or attempt to escape punishment. Instead, he used the trial to express opposition and rejection of Batista's regime and to declare himself as the leader of the Cuban People's Revolution. The court sentenced Fidel to 15 years in prison, while his brother and constant revolutionary partner, Raúl Castro, received a 7-year sentence. However, Fidel emerged from the trial with widespread fame in Cuba, and extensive campaigns were launched for the release of political prisoners by their mothers, intellectuals, university professors, writers, and politicians. Batista calculated that by releasing the prisoners, including Fidel Castro, he would win the Cuban people's favor, thinking anyway that the revolutionary movement couldn't overthrow him because he saw himself protected by the Americans. Batista released Castro and his companions. Upon his release from prison, where he had spent 22 months reading philosophy and history, Castro immediately returned to opposition. He spent this time giving press interviews, holding conferences, and founded an organization with the declared aim of overthrowing Batista's rule. He named the organization the 26th of July Movement, after the day of the attack on Moncada. Fidel Castro was free, but under close surveillance by the Cuban government. In 1955, violence erupted in Cuba, forcing Fidel, Raúl, and some of their comrades to flee to Mexico for fear of Batista's retaliation against them. Once in Mexico, Castro began preparing to return to Cuba to wage guerrilla warfare against Batista's regime. It's important to note that at this time, Fidel was not a communist. He had leftist leanings, but was not a communist. His brother Raúl was a staunch communist, but Fidel avoided any association with the Cuban Communist Party for fear of branding his movement as communist, which would completely alienate the Americans and lose a significant part of the Cuban nationalist movement. Mexico at the time was a haven for revolutionaries fleeing from Latin American countries, many of whom met there and exchanged opinions and experiences. One of these exiles was a young Argentine doctor and journalist named Ernesto Che Guevara. In Mexico, Guevara joined the 26th of July movement. The movement managed to collect substantial donations, and Fidel spent $15,000 to purchase a small yacht for transporting the rebels from Mexico to Cuba. The yacht, a decrepit vessel from the U.S. Navy, barely fit 12 people. On the midnight of November 25, 1956, Fidel, Raúl, Che Guevara, and 79 others boarded this yacht, heading to a landing area in southeast Cuba. Neither the boat was equipped for such a journey, nor were the people on board prepared for sailing in stormy weather, and all suffered from seasickness. In addition to breakdowns that hit the boat on the third day, the boat eventually arrived in Cuba after 8 days, 2 days later than the agreed date, which shouldn't have been a significant problem. However, the delay was disastrous because there was an agreement between Castro and Frank Paez Garcia, a revolutionary leader in Cuba, that Garcia would start an armed revolution on the day the boat with the returning rebels arrived. Frank Garcia had already started his movement, and the Cuban government had crushed it before the boat arrived. Not only that, but Batista's regime also knew that a boat was bringing Castro and his comrades, and as soon as the boat arrived and its occupants disembarked on the shore, a battle ensued from which only 19 individuals from the group that came from Mexico survived. Among the survivors were Fidel Castro, Raúl, Che Guevara, and a colleague who would become a prominent leader of the revolution, Camilo Cienfuegos. Despair did not infiltrate Fidel Castro and his men, who regrouped in the mountainous Sierra Maestra region. With the help of the local population, they began organizing guerrilla warfare aimed at overthrowing Batista's regime. The next step of the revolution occurred on March 13, 1957, when an attack on the presidential palace aimed to assassinate President Batista. However, this attack was not carried out by Fidel Castro and his group, but by a group mostly comprised of students who called themselves the Revolutionary Directorate of Students. The attack's goal was to kidnap Batista, then assassinate him and take control of the radio station to announce the news to the Cuban people and call for a general strike. The attack failed, and 30 of the 50 attackers were killed during the attempt. However, disturbances began in Cuba, especially in the capital Havana and in Santiago de Cuba. The disturbances following the assassination attempt on Batista continued until August 1957, until Batista issued decrees banning freedom of assembly and freedom of expression, perfectly timing it as the country was preparing for the election scheduled for 1958. The Americans began to grow wary of Batista and his violent actions towards his people. It looked very bad to the world that they were supporting a dictator while preaching democracy and human rights across the globe. Batista had become a burden to them as much as his legitimacy eroded. The United States, typically fearful of any liberatory atmospheres in Latin America, and Latin American peoples also fear American intervention in their affairs, as they did in countries like Guatemala. But Batista offered the Americans exports at special prices and was completely loyal to them, allowing their legitimate and illegitimate interests to flourish in his country. Therefore, the Americans decided to continue supporting him, at least because his main opponent, Fidel Castro, had a hint of communism that made the Americans uncomfortable. 1958 was a year of unrest in Cuba, with all armed opposition movements, including Castro's, engaging in violent acts against Batista's regime, whether against the army, police, or economic interests, especially sugar refineries and tourist facilities. Facing these disturbances, Batista postponed the elections, which led to an escalation of protests, and the Communist Party, led by Juan Marinello, called for a general strike. On May 24, 1958, Batista began the Spring Campaign against the 26th of July movement in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, sending 6 battalions of the army, supported by air and naval forces, with the goal of encircling Castro's rebel group, cutting off its supply lines, and then completely destroying it. This sounds good, but the forces Batista sent were composed of new recruits with no experience in field combat, while Castro and his men had experience and were well acquainted with the area they were fighting in. The rebel forces, led by Che Guevara, ambushed the government forces, killing 86 soldiers. 2 weeks later, Castro and his companions ambushed another government force, killing 40 soldiers and wounding 240. Most of the government forces' prisoners joined the rebels after their capture, indicating the low morale of Batista's forces. During the battles, one of the Cuban army's battalions withdrew to lure Castro into pursuing it, which indeed happened, leading the rebel forces into an ambush where they lost 70 of their men. After this battle, Castro was forced to withdraw to reorganize and rearm, ending Batista's campaign with a significant moral victory for Castro, who emerged from the battle as the primary leader of the Cuban Revolution. Batista not only lost the battle, but also lost the initiative to the rebels after they captured a large amount of weapons in their battles with the army. In October 1958, Castro and other rebel groups were the ones attacking the army. Castro descended with his forces from the Sierra Maestra Mountains and attacked the Oriente region, taking cities one after the other, along with other rebel groups. By the end of December, Guevara was leading the 26th of July movement forces, achieving a final victory in South Santa Clara, while a force led by Camilo Cienfuegos also defeated government forces in North Santa Clara, opening the way for the rebel forces to the most important cities in central Cuba. Guevara's force occupied the city of Santa Clara and managed to prevent Batista's forces from retaking the city, which Guevara defended well and took full control of. On December 30th, the control of Santa Clara divided Cuba in two, historically speaking, with the right side being the impoverished south and the left the wealthy northeast. After the Battle of Santa Clara, the rebels captured a train full of weapons heading to the government forces, now armed to the teeth, paving the way for them to the grand prize, the capital, Havana. The day following the fall of Santa Clara was significant because it was the day Batista relinquished power on January 1st, 1959. Batista handed over the government to the army's commander, General Eulogio Cantillo Porras, marking a new era for Cuba, which was clear that Fidel Castro would be its new face. When Batista fell, Castro was negotiating in the south for the surrender of Santiago de Cuba, which he entered and gave a speech from the city council's balcony, declaring the victory of the revolution and refusing to recognize General Cantillo Porras' authority. At the same time, Guevara and Cienfuegos were quickly moving their forces to Havana, entering the Cuban capital on January 2nd, the same day Castro entered Santiago de Cuba. Their triumphant entry into the capital caused Cantillo's rule to collapse, and the leftist lawyer opposed to Batista, Manuel Urrutia Reo, was appointed president of the country by a government mostly comprised of Castro's supporters. They chose him because he was well-educated and Christian, making him acceptable to the United States. But, in reality, power remained in the hands of the revolutionaries who kept their weapons and thus retained actual power in Cuba. Castro entered Havana on January 8th and stayed in the upper floor of the Havana Hilton Hotel, declaring himself the representative of the Revolutionary Armed Forces to the presidency. Although he was not officially in power, he began using his influence to combat corruption and illiteracy in Cuba. At the same time, he initiated a campaign to punish supporters of Batista's regime, especially those involved in acts of repression. Political parties were abolished after the revolution as a temporary measure. By the way, to this day, parties are still banned in Cuba. The Argentine revolutionary leader, Che Guevara, was granted Cuban citizenship and placed in charge of the old Fort La Habana, which was later turned into a prison and venue for show trials conducted for Batista's men. Most of the trials overseen by Guevara ended in execution sentences, which, they say, pleased the Cuban people and Castro, who rejected any criticisms of these sentences and described them as revolutionary justice. In mid-February 1959, Fidel was appointed prime minister, and about 2 months later, he visited the United States at the invitation of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. Even at this point, Castro never declared himself a communist nor had any relations with the Soviets. Yet, the Americans were skeptical of him because he was a proponent of nationalizing American interests in Cuba and advocated for agricultural reform, symptoms of communism to the Americans. To improve his image before the Americans, Castro hired a public relations firm and embarked on an 11-day tour between Washington and New York, which attracted excessive media interest. However, he did not meet with President Dwight Eisenhower, who intentionally avoided meeting Castro by going on a golf vacation, leaving him to meet with Vice President Richard Nixon at the time. Nixon's assessment of Castro was that the man was either completely naive about communism or a staunch communist pretending otherwise, with the likelihood being that he was naive, according to Nixon. After returning to Cuba, Castro began implementing the reforms promised by the revolution. He reduced the salaries of judges and government officials and increased the salaries of lower-ranking employees. He also reduced housing rents and the prices of electricity and fuel. But all these were minor compared to the most critical reform: agricultural reform. Castro appointed himself president of the National Institute of Agrarian Reform and introduced the first package of reforms. Any land or farm exceeding 3,333 acres and any property exceeding 1,000 acres were confiscated and redistributed to peasants in plots not exceeding 67 acres per family, and foreign ownership of sugarcane plantations was completely banned. The original landowners were compensated with bonds in Cuban currency, essentially receiving nothing. These decisions ended the massive American ownership of Cuban agricultural land, and 200,000 families acquired land. 60% of Cuba's land remained owned by the peasants, and the rest was owned by the state. President Urrutia criticized Castro and his inexplicable actions, which seemed to be those of communists. Castro then resigned from his position as prime minister. This resignation was political theater. The Cuban people revolted, with about 500,000 citizens surrounding the presidential palace and demanding the resignation of the president, whom Castro accused on television that day of obstructing the revolution's progress. Urrutia resigned at the people's request. Castro returned as prime minister, and Osvaldo Dorticas Torrado, a supporter of Castro, was appointed president. This began Castro's step towards consolidating power. The following 2 years were a leap in social and economic reforms. On August 6, 1959, Castro nationalized the Cuban Telephone Company, 3 oil refineries, and 21 sugar mills. The following month, he nationalized banks and major commercial and industrial companies owned by foreigners. He then issued a law on housing reform, nationalizing all residential buildings and redistributing them to the people. These nationalizations caused enormous losses for Cuban upper-class and American companies, but, of course, greatly increased Castro's popularity among the people, allowing him to delay the promised political reform and reject any attempts for political factions to share power. Che Guevara and Raúl Castro took ministerial positions and helped Castro strengthen his authority, but their presence as communists sent a message to the world that the Cuban Revolution was turning communist. Castro ended independent press and arrested many opponents of the communist direction the Cuban Revolution was taking. Cuban society gradually transformed into one of informers, with everyone spying on each other to ensure loyalty to the revolution, leading to widespread arrest campaigns. Cuba's intellectuals began to emigrate as Castro shifted further left, with qualified professionals in various fields fleeing, most of them to the United States, along with a significant number of intellectuals. But not all of Castro's opponents fled Cuba. Some took up arms against him and started campaigns similar to the one he used to seize power, some of whom were former comrades in arms before the revolution's success. Remember, the revolution by its nature is a fierce beast. Its children are its first victims. Camilo Cienfuegos disappeared after a mysterious plane crash and was then considered the most important martyr of the revolution, with fingers pointed at Castro for his disappearance, as Cienfuegos was believed to have opposed the arrests Castro was making against his comrades. Che Guevara made sharp statements against the Soviet Union, and Castro considered him a burden on Cuban-Soviet relations, allowing him to continue his struggle in other countries like Congo and Bolivia until the American intelligence eventually captured and killed him, also turning him into a martyr for the Cuban Revolution. Not only did the relationship between Castro and some Cubans deteriorate, but the relationship between Cuba and the United States also rapidly worsened. Washington was entirely opposed to the nationalization of lands and interests owned by Americans. In response, Washington imposed a ban on its imports from Cuba, especially sugar, Cuba's most important resource, opened the doors to the migration of opponents to Castro's rule, and began supporting opposition groups resisting his revolutionary rule. In September 1959, Castro returned to the United States, but this time he did not meet any American officials. He was attending the United Nations General Assembly sessions. Castro met important leaders, including Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, marking perhaps the first contact between the Cuban Revolution and the Soviet Union. Moscow had been reserved towards the Cuban Revolution from the start, not confident in Fidel Castro's ideological leanings. But as Cuban-American relations deteriorated, Cuba became closer to the Soviet Union, becoming an important ally for it. Castro stood in the UN General Assembly and delivered the longest speech in its history, lasting 4.5 hours, criticizing American imperialism in Latin America, and Cuban-American relations completely collapsed from the beginning of 1961. Castro ordered the American embassy to reduce its staff to 11 people or fewer. America considered this a severance of diplomatic and consular relations and informed the Cuban authorities of the complete severance of relations. This was the final blow to any hope of Castro returning from the communist path because, after that, Cuba had no ally but the Soviet Union, and America had a communist neighbor less than 150 kilometers from Florida. Thus, the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro, not only reshaped the island's destiny, but also set the stage for a new era in global politics, fundamentally altering the Cold War dynamics and Cuba's relationship with the world.